All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. It's great to have such a wonderful turnout. We just want to discuss today about there and back again, our journey in this whole ambiguous atmosphere of do we return to work, do we not, how it's been co-leading teams in all of this, everyone kind of spread out everywhere. And we just wanted to hear from our panelists, their experience and their leadership on how they're managing their teams through all of this uncertain times. So we'll go ahead and do a welcome, introduce our panelists, and then we'll go into our prepared questions. We've got some questions for each of our panelists to answer. And then at 6:15, we'll open up for Q&A. And we ask everybody to go ahead, if you have any questions throughout the panel questions, go ahead and put your question in the Zoom chat and we'll go ahead and address it at the end here. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
Oh, excellent. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce our three panelists. So starting with Reshma Patel-Jackson, she's the Managing Director at Attain Partners. And we have Marsha Williams, CEO of Kairos PDX, and Beth Gibbs, the Director of People and Culture at Impact Northwest. So we are very grateful to have them with us. So please welcome our panelists. All right, at that, I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see each other's faces. Okay. And then for all of our guests, it's your choice if you want to be on camera or not. I know it's been a long day, so I completely understand whatever you choose.
So, yeah, so to get us started, I guess I'll select Marsha first for our first question. What's been your approach for the whole return to office, and why is that your approach?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for having me this evening. It's nice to be able to have an opportunity to chat about this experience. I know it's been a journey for everybody. So Kairos PDX is actually an educational nonprofit. And so as such, our primary direct service is actually a K-5 charter school. And so as a result, a big part of our return to kind of being in our building is tied to us having that educational institution that is directed by our Oregon Department of Education that kind of directs what we can and can't do. So we opened back up with a hybrid learning plan back in April. We had shut down from just kind of like everybody else that Friday, March 13th was done. And then it really was that first week of April when we got back from our spring break in 2021 that we opened back doors. And that was really driven by that at that time, the specific component of being a school. Now, regarding the rest of our staff, because as I said, we're an educational nonprofit, but we're more than a school. That was much more directed by what we were seeing and the kind of spread that was going on in the population. And so that's what really drove. It was much more, we were trying to be as an organization that is serving predominantly African-American families and youth. We have taken on overall, I would say, a more conservative approach, just because we know of the disproportionate impact COVID has had, particularly on the African-American community. So we've tried to be a little bit more conservative, I think, in general. But the driving factor definitely was the school factor. And then even now we still have about half of our, I would say, rest of our team still working remote. And that's definitely driven by just what's going on in community and population.
Great, thanks. Reshma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so Attain is a consulting firm similar to Propeller. We serve higher education, nonprofit, and state and local governments here. We're based right outside of the DC metropolitan area. As a consulting firm, we've always worked in a hybrid environment. So the biggest shift for us was for our people that were close to our headquarters. They shifted to a fully virtual environment. So when it actually came to developing our approach, we followed CDC guidelines as well as state and local information. We tried to look at what the statistics look like in our region. Since last year to now, there was a few months where we did fully open back up with mask policies and things like that. As of right now, we have a temporary policy in place that we're evaluating month over month. Where all non-essential employees that are based out of our area have to work virtually. So for employees that are essential employees, they're allowed to come into the office, but they have to complete a health survey on a weekly basis. And then there's protocols that we have in place at work, like you have to be masked in all common areas and in conference rooms. You can unmask if you're in your office. So that's really the protocol that we have in place. But even with essential workers, you do not have to come in if you don't feel comfortable. So at no point in time is anyone obligated to come in, whether they're essential or non-essential. For employees that are based at a client site, we ask that they follow and prioritize the client guidance and the protocols that they have in place. But if we ever have an employee that does not feel comfortable going onto the client site, we have our CEO reach out to that client and just talk it over with them, think about what we can do to actually create a virtual environment for that individual. We haven't had too many of those issues because most of our clients are not requiring us to be at a client site at this time. So the issue, like throughout this whole time, we've had one circumstance where it's come up and we've been able to resolve it. So again, we haven't closed the office completely right now, but it's just limited access.
Great, thank you. And this next question is for Beth. Once we realized that this all was going to last longer than a couple weeks, what were concerns about, how to, get your team on board, and what were your steps to mitigate any of these concerns with this being an ongoing, we don't know when it's going to end sort of thing?
Yeah, so Impact Northwest is a local nonprofit that does social services for families experiencing poverty. We have a wide variety of different services. And prior to March 2020, we were doing most everything in person. So we had to really churn on a dime to figure out how to get everybody remote and deliver services in person that had been in-person services to our clients remotely. Our teams really did a great job becoming very creative and figuring out how to do that shift. But once it was apparent that it was going to go on for a while, it was like, how do we make sure we're delivering those services to our clients, that we're able to support people who are experiencing houselessness during a time where, we're trying to do that remote. We did change. We have always had some part of our offices kind of open, but we did a lot like Reshma's office where we have limited access. We were also worried about what our funders would do because we are predominantly driven by government contracts, and those have outcomes and determinations that we have to fulfill. We did a lot of advocacy with our funders, and our funders were also very flexible to shift what we needed to deliver. I think one of a good example is our school services. So we have a lot of after school services where we're teaching classes for students, and that was not something that was possible. So what we did was we unfortunately did have to let go of some of our seasonal workers, but our core staff there switched from providing after school to providing food boxes for those who are food insecure after the school shut down and they didn't have access to free lunch and things like that. So the concerns were quickly met with our creativity of our staff, their ingenuity to really just come up with great solutions. And we were just there to listen to them and advocate for the services that they wanted, that they saw that the community needed to provide.
Great. And Marcia.
Yeah, I would say I would piggyback on a lot of what Beth said. I think we took the approach of this is an opportunity for innovation, because as an educational nonprofit, a lot of what we're doing is we are really trying to change the narrative around how do our kids access education and how do we change the narrative around Black and brown kids. And so for us, we leaned into relationship in a way that we felt like was really necessary. We did for families on the Learning Academy side, we did a lot of more touch bases. So each of our students had an opportunity to have a daily check-in with another adult staff person. And it could just be reading a book, it could just be checking on your day, but it was just like creating those opportunities to make sure a relationship was established. And then really the other part was just really thinking, like for us in education, where you think about a system that is quite broken. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be challenged and changed, in my opinion. It was really an opportunity to think about how do we make some of those shifts to think about how we can approach it. And so for us, we really leaned into innovation in a way of what are some things that we can do different? How is it that we can approach this different? How can we make sure that families and students are feeling connected even in the midst of, particularly not everybody, everybody's navigated through being home and being in this pandemic differently. And so that was a big piece, I think, as far as our Learning Academy side. I think when I think about our actual staff, I think the other piece that we needed to do is a lot more pouring into making sure their needs were met, a lot more checking, giving resource to our employee assistance program, where making sure that they had outlets and spaces to really get their needs met, right? So our EAP program allowed for, and so we really promoted that and really encouraged staff to take time, even time during work time, to make sure that they were getting their needs met, because I think that was the other piece. As it went on, for some staff, it was great. And for some staff, I mean, they were itching to be back in more social space and just have that kind of connection again with staff. So it varied depending on the staff. And we really tried our hardest to just recognize where each person was and try to meet the needs. I mean, we can't meet the needs of everybody, but we tried our best to really understand where people are and then do a lot of check-ins. So a lot of like peer check-ins, a lot of like staff huddles, to really make sure that needs were being met.
Great, thank you. And then what approaches did you take to lead your remote team in order to boost or maintain your efficiency and your innovation? And what kinds of things worked well and what things did you try that just didn't work out? And I'd like to ask Reshma first.
Yeah, so I have always managed a hybrid team where some of us have been remote and some of us are in person. But now that we were fully remote, we just thought it was important to at least touch base twice a week. One for 30 minutes and one for an hour, where if we don't use the whole hour, we'll give it back. But every Monday and Friday, we touch base as a team. Monday is just to kind of set the tone for the week, and Friday is to close out. And we just found this important because it brings us all together. Whereas, if we were in the office, we would probably see each other more and connect with each other every day. Sometimes if we're all on different projects, we don't get to connect in that way. So it's nice to have those touch points along the way. And then for us, and I don't know if you guys have gone through this, but we're spending a lot of time addressing meeting fatigue. So, just being in back-to-backs all day, meeting fatigue has been something that's really been burdensome on our teammates. So what we started to do is we're piloting no meeting blocks. So every Monday and Friday from 4 to 5 p.m., we are not allowed to schedule any internal meetings. So if it's a client meeting, obviously we cannot say no to a client meeting. But if it's an internal meeting, we try to schedule around those blocks to give people some time at the end of the day to really catch up on emails and do the extra work that they need to do for their clients. So that's something that we're working on.
Great, thank you. Marcia.
Yeah, I echo that. We definitely tried the meeting blocks, like just blocking off time. The fatigue is so real. I mean, I'm sure you guys will experience it as well. So we definitely did that same piece. I think the other piece that we tried, actually with the help of Propeller, we had some great support in creating a charter doc where we actually separated our groups into what we call morning huddles. And so we had a 10-minute morning huddle every day. It was optional, so you didn't have to come to it, but it was co-led. So it's not like we had one person leading, but whoever got on, some people just played music. The goal was you can't talk about work. So you weren't allowed to come on and ask any questions about work. But it was meant to be more just like the check-in of like what would typically happen in the staff lounge, right? You're grabbing your coffee. What happened this weekend? What happened last night? What, like things that are just, you usually would have a more social interaction. And so it turned out different folks brought either things they were working on. Found out we have all these musicians in our group who were sharing different like music that they liked. I mean, we did it based off of kind of the group that you typically would work with. So it was kind of nice. And I think it brought a different angle to folks. We really always tried to keep it to 10 minutes, didn't make it long, but it made it kind of like this thing that was an honored time, the start of the day that you can choose to do. And a lot more staff ended up taking advantage of it. And it connected people, I think, in a way that I think even you wouldn't have done in person, quite honestly. So it was pretty unique and I think quite powerful. And since we've gone back to kind of this hybrid, they're still doing it twice a week. So that was done 5 days a week, actually. They're still doing it now twice a week with some of the staff on site and some of the staff that's remote. And so it's pretty cool.
Okay, great to hear. Beth, would you like to share what approaches you took to maintain efficiency and innovation?
Sure. Since I work in HR, which we've renamed People and Culture, I thought a lot about how we want to get our staff engaged and keep them engaged. If I think about our staff, they're people who want to be doing work with other people. That's why they're in that job. They're here. They want to make those connections. It's also what our staff say about what they like most about working at Impact is the relationships that they build with coworkers, with clients, and moving to remote put a little bit of it changed that, right? It's like you don't get that same connection that you get in person on remote on Zoom. You just don't. So we were trying to figure out ways that we could keep that going. We couldn't have potlucks anymore, which was a bummer. They were a big potluck culture. But we did come up with some things that worked more so earlier in the pandemic, like birthday celebrations. And then what do? If you're all on a Zoom call and you just it's just that kind of weird, like silence until someone speaks. It's a little bit different than you're kind of moving around to different groups at a party. So making sure there was activities really helped, that there's something that kind of focused those, like we did like guess the tune, one of them, and like having games really helped. I have noticed that what we were really great up until I want to say spring, I think the fatigue of that really putting on those events and coming up with that, there's a little bit of fatigue that's happening there, and people really just want to be in person. So bringing a little bit more of that hybrid in as soon as it felt safe, we're kind of pulling back on that again. But that was something that we thought about, employee engagement.
Great, thank you. And then I'd like next to share, were there any problems or benefits that you weren't expecting from leading the remote and hybrid teams that you discovered as you were going along? Resha, I'd like to hear from you first.
Yeah, so the problem and a benefit all in one is productivity. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. I have not seen a team churn out more proposals and deliverables and thought leadership articles in my life. So it was great to see, but it's a difficult balancing act because I know everyone feels like they're overworked too. But what's interesting about it is when you think about this virtual environment, what I've noticed is I have team members that are now online at 7:30 because they're starting their day early because they're answering their emails while they're drinking their cup of coffee, right? And they don't have to go anywhere because their kids may be at home right now. So it's not like they have to leave to go pick up their kids, so they continue working. So really managing the productivity piece of it has been a difficult balancing act. What I do love about it is that we get to see the human part of everybody. Oftentimes when you're at work, you don't get to see that, but I love seeing people's families, their dogs, their pets, their home renovations. That's been really fun to see. And I also think that it makes us closer in a sense. So I feel like just like the team culture has changed because you do see the other side of everybody when they're at home, if they're struggling with their kids or they're having to take care of a loved one. I think all of that has been kind of refreshing to see.
Absolutely, or when your daughter gets stuck in a shopping cart. So
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Valerie, I'm curious from a Propeller perspective, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll say a benefit that I wasn't expecting was it's gotten a lot easier to schedule meetings, not in the sense that I want to have them all day, but it used to be a lot of work to find a conference room to fit the group in. That was always the limiting factor. And now we don't need conference rooms. So that's definitely been a benefit. And then specifically in the Bay Area, commuting time is just a really big piece of a lot of people's day. So I would try not to schedule meetings before 10 because it could take that long to get into the office. But now I can schedule at 9 o'clock and be able to have just a little bit more time in order to get people in a group and figure out problems.
Great. Thanks, Valerie.
Great. Okay, so for our next question, Reshma, I'd like to start with you, but from a leadership perspective, what do you think was the most valuable part about having the whole team co-located when that was possible? And then the flip of that, what's been valuable about having a hybrid or a remote environment?
So I think, like I said before, the productivity piece was definitely the tricky part. I think the hybrid and remote environment, I think one of the difficulties that we really experience with that is feeling included if you weren't part of headquarters. So we've started to implement some best practices to just make sure that, you know, that it is an inclusive environment and you don't feel like you're out of the loop. You know, whether it's like a karaoke happy hour or trivia game night, we try to make sure that we create that culture of inclusivity. So that's really what we've been working on there, is just making sure that even if it is a hybrid environment, that everyone's voices is heard. There are times that I felt like when we do have people that are in the office versus being virtual, decisions are made that the people that are virtual may not have heard about because it happened at headquarters. So managing some of that, just in terms of communications and making sure that we have our teams chat up and we're giving everyone updates. Those things have been really important.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Marcia?
Yeah, I think that for us, the other piece in terms of leading, I think the need to make sure that relationship was at the forefront. So much of who we are as an organization is the experience you have coming on site. So as for our direct service learning academy, it was having in this open policy of families being able to come in. And there was something about just feeling welcomed in a school and in a building where that was our hospitality, I guess, so to speak, was kind of one of the things that drew you in. So when that was limited, I mean, now we were in people's living rooms, we tried to push that more into people's living rooms. So that was one way that we tried to still have that presence of feeling like, hey, we're here to support you, and feeling that connection. And so I think in terms of there was the benefit of being able to be directly into people's homes in terms of in that sense, which was good at least from our student population. That I think was a benefit. I think the biggest challenge that we faced is part of what Reshma was sharing, just in terms of the productivity piece and understanding how people wanted to navigate the experience of having that balance, because it was more that people were, I felt like, working more almost. But then I think the other part is feeling like, do we need to? And for us, when you're direct service with children, the remote learning experience is not one that long-term we feel like is going to serve, especially younger kids when you talk about primary kids. And so for us now, I think one of the continued challenges is really understanding what that means and what that looks like as we transition. Because I still have like instructional staff that are kind of like, yeah, I think I'd like to work remote. And I'm like, our kids are on site. So that's a challenge now, because they kind of feel like, oh, there's pieces of my job I can do. And it's like, no, we don't, there's components and there's definitely positions that don't have that hybrid option. And so I think that's going to continue to be a challenge that I'm trying to navigate, just in terms of like trying to decide what that looks like and trying to decide how do we give some balance, you know, whether it's in the afternoon hours after kids leave. We have, you know, one early release day, maybe it's those afternoons being able to do something remote. But I think there's also this taste of flexibility to kind of some of what you guys mentioned, you know, in terms of like commute times and all those things that we're still trying to navigate, that I think is a challenge.
Okay, thank you. Wow, that leads really well into the next question. So I'll give you a chance to add anything you want first. But I think you answered that pretty decently. It's about what pushback are you getting about your group's return to work plan or return to office? And then as a leader, how are you responding?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest one. It's definitely, particularly my instructional staff. I think other staff really understanding how they want to be able to have that balance that also works with the organizational needs, I think is important. Because I think particularly, you know, this has been an interesting last 2 months, I will say, because I think we went from, you know, everybody preparing to be one way, and then now there's a little bit of a shift. but we still have over 220 kids on site every day. And we're still serving kids in that way. And so for a lot of what we're doing, some of what you were saying, like in terms of like what's happening on site versus people that are hybrid, understanding all of that, it is kind of important that we do have staff understanding all those components, because sometimes the communication gaps are not, are larger than we want them to be. So I would say, I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is really getting people to understand, like, COVID is here to stay, and we're going to need to navigate living with it in a way that I think hasn't been realized completely or fully accepted. And I think that's where we are. And I think that's the pushback we're getting, of like wanting to feel like there needs to be an end date, or there's going to be an end date, as opposed to, no, we're going to continue to navigate this. It's going to continue to be fluid, and we're going to need to be flexible in how we approach this. Of course, adhering to all of the guidelines and requirements. But I think that's going to be, I think that is one of the bigger challenges.
Okay, that's interesting. So the pushback isn't even so much against you or your plan, it's more against the continuation of the pandemic.
Exactly.
Beth, how about you? What pushback have you been getting about your plans?
We've been going really slow. So we had just started this summer talking about, okay, what does a slow return to the office look like, opening it up more? And then the Delta variant really took off. And so we were like, nope, back to where we were. So I think we've got two different sides of our staff. We've got the people for whom they miss being in the office. They miss seeing their clients. They miss that connection. They want it to go faster. And then you've got, on the other flip side, the staff who, they still have a lot of fear. They're not ready to go back. Even if, they might love the remote work and the flexibility, and we're looking at hybrid models, we're not looking at going back to how it was. There's really no returning to how things were. But I'm trying to balance those two different groups, the people who want to move faster, want to start seeing clients in person and making those connections, helping people who are in more desperate situations, versus the staff who are, there's still a lot of fear. There's still a lot of trauma. If you think about the term lockdown, how much trauma there is around just that word, and people aren't necessarily ready to go back to something that's not what they've known, even if they don't love where they're at. So we're continuing to make it slow, working with people kind of on individual basis. Like if someone has a client that needs more high touch, what can we do to get that person that support without it being everybody has to go back?
Okay, thank you. So now talking about building strong teams that aren't co-located. Emily, can you share how you've been working on that?
Sure, thank you. So before March 2020, I had worked in several different co-located and remote teams. One was everyone was completely dispersed all over the world. Nobody shared an office. And another one where we had small offices locally, and then other teams in other countries. So some of the things that I like to do that worked well to kind of keep us all cohesive is a lot of things I already mentioned. One, daily stand-ups, regular check-ins with everybody. And then two, always making sure I touch base one-on-one with everybody on the team, especially when I was in a larger team of like 30 people. That's a lot of people to get through. But especially if you're in different cultures, it's really good to get that connection, because a lot of people don't feel comfortable raising a lot of things or asking a lot of questions in a larger setting. You really want to kind of build that relationship up with them to make sure that they feel comfortable coming to you, so that you can, address whatever needs to be addressed or give them the support that they need. Also being really mindful time zones and where people are at and what's going on with their lives, because I can't tell you how many times I was in an office in New Jersey and I get a message from California saying donuts in the break room. And it's like, well, thanks, gang. So just like making sure that you're being mindful of your communications and who you're including in these communications, just to make sure that everyone feels like they're part of things. And if there's donuts in the break room in California, make sure that everyone has an opportunity to a little something, a little thank you. Just, those little things really matter to make people feel like they're still a part of things and that they're still part of the team, even if they're not physically there. So those are some of the things that I ran into.
Great, thanks, Emily. All right, so as you all know, we're on Zoom right now, and it's been a big part of our life lately. So I want to talk a little bit about how it's been both isolating and offered a new level of vulnerability at the same time. So as mentioned earlier, like we can really see into people's backgrounds, their home projects, their kids. It's really gotten us a chance to get to know each other at a more intimate level than we ever did at the office. So Reshma, could you talk a little bit about how that's impacted you?
Yeah, I think the isolating piece, I have felt a lot. Like, there's been times where I'm just in back-to-backs all day and I'm not really making a human connection, like a physical connection where I see somebody in person. So that has been very isolating. Like, and again, like the back-to-back meetings, normally there's a meeting that you probably could have popped into someone's office and asked the question, but you now have a meeting about it. So that's been a little, as much as you're in back-to-back meetings and you're talking with people at the same time, it feels very isolating. I can't quite put words around it. But that piece has been really difficult. And I feel like I've heard teammates say that. But again, I do like the opportunity of getting to see everyone's life. I think people getting to know a little bit about each other's families, what they're going through. And I feel like the levels of communication around vulnerability, people are a lot more transparent about it, like whether they're in therapy or whatever it may be. I feel like there's a whole new comfort level and a stigma that's being broken through the pandemic in a very positive direction that we should actually lean in on and talk more about, which has been great to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any thoughts on how to encourage employees to continue being vulnerable and fully showing up, even when times aren't so tough?
Yeah, so it's interesting because at Attain Partners, we've gone through a whirlwind of changes. So not only did COVID happen, but we went from being over a 900 plus company to selling our federal division of consulting, and now we're back in startup mode. And our motto lately has been to have grace, and to, and we all constantly say it to each other when we get frustrated. It's like we're all going through things, and we really kind of embodied that within our culture now. Like we're all struggling in some way. It may not be in the same manner. So just remember to have grace when you're frustrated. And it's something that's really kind of taken just in terms of our culture now, because just spinning off into a completely smaller firm and then also going through that in the midst of COVID, it has not been easy. It hasn't been pretty. There's frustrations in so many different ways. So having grace and just making sure that you understand that everyone's intent is always a positive intent. That's something that we really try to establish within our culture. So I find that to be really helpful.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I love that. Have grace.
Yeah.
Beth, can you talk a little bit about your experience of living so much on Zoom and your employees living on Zoom?
Yeah, when we talk about the isolation, I feel like one of the things I've just started to really be aware of that I think is definitely affecting the team is that when you're on the computer all the time, like if you have a meeting, you get to actually get into a different space, talk with people. Maybe you've got your cell phone, but like it can kind of go away. But when you're on this Zoom meeting and there's so much coming at you, you feel like, oh, I can still get this chat. I can still get this email. I can still get all of these little things and still be on the meeting. And multitasking takes away from you being present in the moment. It doesn't feel like you're making those connections. The flip side of that being that it does give us connection into staff. Like we have locations out in Clackamas, in Vancouver, in Forest Grove, all these different sites, sun sites. And we sometimes just really weren't seeing those people when we were in the office because they were in their different locations. And now we get to see their faces a lot more than we would have because we get to see them. They'll be able to make a meeting. The Forest Grove folks don't have to drive all the way into Portland. They can pop up on a screen and we can see them. So it's both of those worlds. Yeah. I don't have an answer for the isolation one in terms of the like distraction. I'm trying to figure that part out. Like I'm trying to make more intentional, like I am present in a meeting. If I was in a person in that meeting, I wouldn't be checked out. So keep my cameras up, and we're trying to encourage our staff to do that as well with flexibility. It's we're working on it, trying to put up together what's the etiquette that we want our staff to have, and how would they want to be treated in a meeting that they're talking in as well, trying to get that communication out while still giving, as Reshma said, that grace to people so that they can turn their cameras off when they need to, and we know they're still there.
Yeah, it's a really important balance to strike. That presence that you get from being able to see someone's face and engage with them, especially when it's someone who wouldn't have normally been able to come to your meetings or to interact with you. So that's a really nice benefit. And then the challenge of figuring out of how to give people that grace to like have downtime and be present on a meeting, but not be engaged with the camera on. Could you talk a little bit about any distractions or detriments that have come up from like constant camera time? Or has that been mostly a positive experience for your group?
I hadn't really thought about that. I think that there's the fatigue and there's that lack of connection, the same stuff that we found. There's the flexibility though, and I feel like one of the things that really was important is with the amount of parents that we have that work for us, particularly the amount of moms. We have 80% of our staff are women identified, and having that flexibility of being remote, and they can turn on a computer and be present in a meeting, and they still have their kids working, and everybody we all had that flexibility of like being on a meeting and having someone have to mute to go tell their kids to stop fighting. And everybody works really well with that, and it's brought a lot of bonding. I think like all the parents can really bond with each other, and like they're seeing that in that moment. It's different seeing that mom face. I love watching that on the coworkers, that mom face that comes on, like, oh, that kid's gonna get in trouble. And other moms can notice and see that as well. I think that's something you don't get when you're in the office because your kids aren't there.
Oh, that's true. You really get to see a different level of your coworkers and just see them in a brand new light in a different role. Emily, I can see you cracking up. Great. So that gets us through all of our prepared questions. I haven't seen anything come in from the chat yet. If anyone has any questions for our panelists, if you want to just add them to the chat right now, I'll give you a minute.
While we're waiting for some more questions to pop in the chat, I came up with a couple of questions just as you all were sharing, just kind of spurred some other thoughts. One is, okay, now that we've gone fully remote, now that we've gone hybrid, do you ever feel like you're going to come back to fully co-located? I guess, Reshma, this isn't necessarily your situation, but is that a thing, or do we kind of like this new model and see the benefits of it? I'm just kind of curious what the long-term plan looks like going forward.
So I don't know if you all have seen, McKinsey recently published this article about just return to work statistics. And one of the things, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they talked about, when they pulse the workforce, they don't want to come back 100%. I think the virtual hybrid model is here to stay. Some people want to come back 2 days a week. Some people don't want to come back at all. They want to remain virtual. So I think what's really going to be telling is the workforce and what their perspective and needs are. Because when you're posting them, they're really telling you pretty clearly that, hybrid should be here, and there's benefits to it.
I think what I've found, even in the process right now of hiring, we've lost like 3 candidates because we have a requirement that you are able to be somewhat hybrid. Like some people really want to be able to work from anywhere and have that flexibility of working from anywhere. And for us, part of it is really, how do you establish the org culture in that remote space where people can really understand what you are about as an organization, what you're trying to do in terms of how you're going to be. So I think we're learning and what that means and what that's going to look like. I agree. I think hybrid is here to stay in some way. And that's what I said, even with our instructional staff now, trying to understand that, okay, what does that look like for there's small amounts of time, but those afternoon times when you don't have kids in the building anymore, like, are we going to be able to be more flexible around giving that time in a different way? And so I think it's definitely something we're considering, and definitely something that, you know, people are making us know that these are some of the needs they have now given this experience. And so we're going to have to shift with and think about how to do that in a way that really values people.
Yeah, I agree with all that. We probably will be doing a hybrid model of some sort, even though we were predominantly all in office. We always had a flexibility with schedules, but I think that remote work there'll be more flexibility for that. And that's really what we've seen in this last year. And we were even seeing it pre-pandemic. We were, you know, my supervisor and I were sitting in our offices, our administrative offices, pre-pandemic, and looking around in the afternoon, and we were the only two people there, thinking, I think we could do something different and save some money on rent and have a smaller space, because people are taking advantage of that flexibility, and good on them.
Yeah, nice. Like we all bought the work from home desks now. Might as well keep using them. Yeah, and I love what you mentioned, Beth, about the space. That brings up another question one of our attendees had. How are your organizations addressing the prior investments in like real estate and things with now we're going into hybrid? Not right now. See, there we go, the children. Now that we're going into hybrid, you know, what are your plans for your physical spaces and offices and infrastructure?
We'll still have physical spaces because we need to meet the clients. And, you know, one of our centers before COVID hit was a day center for people who are houseless, that they could come in and have a safe space to check a computer and get a food box. So that is going to continue. For other spaces, though, like our administrative offices, we have already canceled a lease on a larger space, gotten a new space that's much smaller, and we'll have more like, instead of having your desk with all of your stuff, it will be a space where you can go in. Any of our sites, any of our staff could go in and use the space, reserve a desk, and that way we can see more of our different locations. Get to, you know, that was something our team, our people and culture team, were doing once a month, was going to site locations so that they know our faces and they could have that question. Because, you know, you might not send an email, but you see our benefit person walking down the hallway, they will ask a question that they might forget otherwise. So we're going to keep continuing that, but in a much more flexible way.
Kairos was really fortunate. We actually just signed an extended lease with Portland Public Schools. So we actually have more space to make sure that we have sufficient space for people, if they want to come in, can come in and feel that distance, right? Because like I said, you know, especially with our direct service, we are going to be serving kids direct with in person. And the reality is COVID is here for a while. Like, it's not really going anywhere. And so just making sure that we're adhering to all the procedures, all of the safety protocols, which we have a ton, preparing ourselves to make sure that people feel like they can come into a space that feels safe.
Yeah, so Attain Partners got a little lucky here. Since we recently spun out, we actually gave our old space to the organization that acquired our federal division. So we got to start a new lease at a new company, or at a new building in the midst of COVID, and we picked a very small suite-like space to see how that would work. We were originally going to go into a larger building and occupy a full floor, and we decided not to, just because with COVID, we knew a lot of people weren't coming in. But when I've talked to some of my peers in the industry, there's a lot going on with real estate in general. I think the footprint will go down. But what we're seeing is a lot of companies are repurposing how they use their space. So to make it more appealing for the workforce that they do want to have come in, or client meetings that they do want to have, that the actual facility is appealing to come into, whether it's getting a new gym or something like that, potentially renovating the space that you're in is an option that a lot of companies here, at least in the DMV, are looking into.
Great, thanks,
Marsha, this next question is for you. You talked about unstructured morning huddles, while Reshma and Beth mentioned slightly more activity-focused virtual meets. So the question for you is, what do you think supported the success of a morning huddle? Sorry, what supported the success of the morning huddles? Did it have anything to do with pre-existing culture or close staff relationships?
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because I think that is a core component of what I was getting at when I said the struggle of making sure that staff we were hiring understood how important it was to be on site. Because the culture that we've set as an organization, for one, our mission is to close the racial achievement and opportunity gaps. As such, we are very clear that we have a stance where we are coming against white supremacy in public education. And so what that means is that taking an active stance means that you're actually engaging to do something different, right? So that there's an active action of that. And so part of the culture that we've created at Kairos is reflective practice, because we all bring biases to all the work that we do. It's a fact, regardless of who you are, where you come from. And so a lot of the underlying culture of what we try to do at Kairos is reflective practice is a part of it. So we do clearings and kudos in all of our meetings, an opportunity to do, whether it's like all staff, like, hey, I kind of messed up, whatever it is, but we've made it a norm that is part of the culture and how we operate. And so I think that culture brings that, setting that as a standard in terms of the culture that we want as an organization, then brings a level of expectation that you are bringing your full self to the work, and that you're bringing that reflective practice to be thoughtful about how is it that I'm engaging with my staff? How is it that I'm treating people? How is it that I'm going, directly to people? That they're, and actually, when people were talking about one of the isolating things, or the things that we've actually actively had to work on, it's these direct chats. Like I get, I'll be in a meeting, and as opposed to someone sharing what they're thinking, they'll send me a private chat. And it's like, go ahead and share that with the group, right? And trying to like sometimes make things that wouldn't happen in a conference room, right? You'd either share or not share, but you wouldn't have an opportunity to let other people in the room actually know what you're thinking. I mean, I guess you could with text now, I guess. But to Beth's point, like a lot of times that phone is kind of down and you're present. And so that's been one of the challenges too, is really making sure that people are still showing up authentically themselves, still bringing their full selves, and still doing it in a way that values people, which is a fine balance, because I think we've all been, particularly in this time, at our wits' ends for different things, right? Whether it's the personal side or the professional side, balancing that is different. And so I would say for Kairos, I think it's definitely the culture that we've set as an organization. And part of that is the experience of really deciding that you're going to bring your authentic self, and you're going to recognize the deficiencies, or recognize those times when we've fallen short. And grace is definitely a big piece of the wording that we use at Kairos as well. Is like, okay, we're going to just recognize and even to see like, okay, clearly I was not at my best self this morning, right? Like clearly there were other things going on, and being able to just own that and acknowledge it. And I think there's power in that, and there's power in then creating a culture that allows for people to see, we're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question here. What do you look out for to know if a team member is maybe struggling or starting to disengage? And how do you figure out what's needed? Do you check in with them, or, how do you kind of bring them back or assess what's going on?
So one of the things that we did on our team is we do this free personality test online. It's called 16personalities.com. And it's a fun test, and it really kind of aligns with the Myers-Briggs. My Myers-Briggs was the same as 16 personalities, and so was a lot of my teammates. But I kind of used that profile for my teammates to see how I would engage with them. So if there's a time where I feel like someone is disengaged or they seem to be having a bad day, I really look at their personality type as a way for me to really figure out how should I engage with them. For some of my teammates that are introverts, I find pinging them and just checking in and saying, hey, do you want to touch base? I feel like, something's off. Like, I just want to let you know that I'm here if you want to talk. And just extend an olive branch that way. It does wonders. whereas others really want you to set up a time to chat with them. So I kind of use their workplace behaviors that I see in that profile to really understand how to best engage with them.
That impact, so thinking about it from like the larger HR perspective, we try and make sure we have a lot of different resources for staff. Like sometimes that disengagement, people are struggling in their personal life, right? It's not that they're not doing it intentionally most of the time, right? Performance issues often come because people are feeling overwhelmed, particularly in this day and age. So we've made sure that we implemented self-care days, which were just 4 paid days. They reset every year. You take them as you need them. There's not really any questions asked about that. That's in addition to PTO. We have a big initiative around self-care, making sure people, because this is work that really does burn people out, doing social services, working with very vulnerable populations. So we do that. We also started this last year, one of our benefits was to offer free mental health phone face-to-face video sessions for anyone who's on our health plan. It's 100% free, it's unlimited. And so that really provides a variety of different supports, but we also try and make sure we have it internally. So we have our DEI manager and another staff member who's part of our EDI team, who both have that option, for staff to reach out to them. It really also helps with Black, Brown, Asian, and immigrant employees that need somebody who, if they don't have a supervisor that understands what they're going through, they have somebody who understands that connection of what they're going through, and they have that as a resource through our DEI manager or somebody else, our affinity groups, so that they're not alone. When the election was happening, that was impacted everybody, or when the attack on the Capitol happened, that impacted everybody, but it particularly impacted different groups of our employees more intensely than others. And so we wanted to make sure that they had those resources internally as well, so that they could be the best that they could, like they would have something here, not just externally. We're not just like, oh, well, that's a you problem, take care of that elsewhere. We want that something that they have internally as well.
Great, thank you for sharing that. All right, we're just about at time now. Wow, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Beth, Marsha, Reshma. We're so grateful to have you here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us and your leadership experience. It's really been a pleasure having you here. Emily, anything else from you?
No, I just want to extend my gratitude as well for Reshma, Marsha, and Beth for coming in and sharing your experience and your leadership today. It's been wonderful listening to you, and very inspiring too. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you everyone so much for joining. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and a great week.
Excellent.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.